I've really been looking forward to having an opportunity to talk to you about your new book, which is called Open: Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World. What struck me about this book that's so different from maybe other books in this sort of genre was that you really went on a journey, like quite a journey to write it. This wasn't just like you had an idea that you'd been, I mean, I know you're a philosopher. It wasn't like you just had an idea that you sat there in front of your computer and gave 8 months to writing it down. You really gave yourself and immersed yourself in some pretty wacky experiences even along the
Mm.
way in the process of writing this book. And I've been looking forward to asking you what sparked all of that for you? What made you want to write this book?
I had no idea what the answers were going to be at the outset. I just knew that there was a really interesting question here that I wanted to explore. I had spent about 15 years in really dedicated meditation and yoga practice, even though I had all this formal training as a philosopher. I was having this experience where it felt like my mind was almost like closing down. Like the space in my mind kept getting smaller. And what I mean by that is that I would start to experience some uncomfortable sensations in my body or a difficult emotion or a scary thought or something like that. And instead of having the ability to stay with that experience, it was like there was this almost instantaneous urge to distract myself, to reach for my phone, to experience some quick hit of political outrage. And it's not that I hadn't experienced that before, but what I was noticing is that there was like this momentum of closure happening. And that was the word I landed on for it, was something like closed. And I realized I wasn't the only one having this experience, that on some level, so many of us now are having this experience of just increasingly distracting ourselves, finding ourselves craving our screens at odd hours, the inability to experience an idle moment in life. I got really interested in, first of all, understanding what is this thing called closure and why does it seem to be intensifying in our modern age? And then I also got really interested in, okay, well, how then can we cultivate more openness in the mind? And I know that sounds really abstract, but in some ways, I started to see this is like the big game here. Because if we have a little bit more space in our mind, we can be responsive instead of reactive. We can create new and better habits more easily. To the focus of your show, that space in the mind is the space of creativity. Ultimately, I think it's the space of freedom.
Hmm.
And so it's like this huge deal, even though it doesn't seem like it should be that important, having a little bit more space in your mind.
You said something a second ago. I wrote it down. The inability to experience an idle moment. And I think we see that everywhere, waiting for the kids at the after school pickup. People are on their phones. We're in a doctor's office. We're on our phone. Like we're constantly looking for this something to fill in that. It's like the idea of even just being spacious scares us. You write about this sort of shocking experiment that you did at home, sort of at the beginning of the book, as a way to feel into more and learn more about how we close. And I say shocking because as I was reading it, I felt myself feeling really anxious for you. I was like, oh my God, what if he gets lost in there? What if he can't pull himself out? Uh, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that experiment.
I wanted to really understand these forces of closure and, the reason that so many of us are experiencing this craving for our screens. I thought it would be really interesting, instead of trying to restrain myself, which is the usual strategy, and it's not a bad strategy, right? Creating all these constraints and self-binding behaviors and screen-free practices, that's all good. But I thought it would be really interesting to try out the other direction. So rather than restraint, play with overindulgence. And this is a practice that has a long history in the tantric Buddhist tradition where they often call this feast practice. And the idea is that we can basically begin to explore the other side of craving by indulging in these things that draw us. And by doing that, we can actually sometimes even destroy the root of some of these cravings and urges that we have. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to spend 3 days, all day, every day, just gorging on this buffet of digital distraction? And for me, the primary drivers of distraction in my life are things like news, and social media, TV, email. So the way I set it up is basically just told my family, "Hey, I'm going to disappear for a few days. You're going to see me a little bit, but I'm mostly just going to be watching TV and on my screens." And I learned a few really interesting things. One is that this link between insomnia and lack of sleep and screens is real. So every night I was up at like 2:40 a.m. with no hope of going back to sleep. But I think the more important thing that I learned is I started to see what was driving me, what was driving all of us in terms of our screen addiction. And what was driving me was this experience or this seeking out of novelty, something new, right? You think about you open your lock screen and you go into your phone, it's that experience of seeing the new text or like the new email or the fresh feed on Instagram or the new news on your news app. And what was really intriguing about this whole experiment is that by spending 3 days all day, every day with my screen, I got to a certain point where nothing was new. It was almost like I had seen everything there was to see. And as a result, I had essentially annihilated the superpower of my phone, which is this ability to give me novelty. So the craziest thing that happened was the day after this experiment, I woke up and had the thought, this is where I usually go and grab my phone and check my latest text messages, things like that. And for the first time in almost a decade, that thought just completely fell flat. Like it wasn't even there. And so what I realized is we can alter our relationship with our screens through fasting. And I think that's a great practice, things like dopamine fasting. But we can also alter our relationship with our screens through overindulgence, indulging so much that we almost reach this point of repulsion. And that too has this kind of paradoxical healing power to it.
What came up for me during that was it seems like a big cross section of us is stuck in a place that's kind of in between. So we're not even kind of in between, but close to they're not quite overindulged yet. Like we're still waking up. Like I wake up every morning and I look at my phone and I realized the other day, after reading your book, I realized the other day, what am I looking for? I'm looking for like the feeling I had was I think I'm looking for like the email announcing that I'm gonna win the Oscar, but I'm not even an actor. Like, I'm looking for some big or that I won the lottery, like some big crazy news. I'm looking for something that doesn't exist. I'm looking for some big hit that doesn't exist. You share some stats in the book. I'm gonna read some of them because some of them were so staggering. The average American adult spends 11 hours on electronic devices each day. The average smartphone user taps, types, swipes, or clicks their devices 2,617 times a day. Half of teenagers describe themselves as having a significant addiction to their phone. They get weirder. This is where they start getting weirder. 40% of respondents chose their phone over their pets. 54% of millennials would choose their phone over their partner. Okay, and these ones we have to talk about them because I can't believe they're actually true. 12% of people would rather go blind than give up their smartphone, and 10% of people would rather cut off a finger than give up their smartphone. What is going on here? What is going on here? That's crazy to me, given that we know the emptiness of it. We know that we feel yucky. We know that it's this devoid. We know that we're looking, we get the dopamine hit, but it's always a disappointment. How do we still feel this way about our devices? There's a place we get sort of stuck unless we've done that overindulging thing where we're almost in a trance and we're still looking for it. What happens for the people who are stuck there? How do we pull ourselves out of that low grade addiction?
Yeah, it's a really strange phenomenon. And I'm glad you read those statistics because I think that they dispel the idea, which a lot of people have, that like, oh, well, we had TV 30 years ago. We had the radio 100 years ago. This isn't that big of a deal. I think this really is a big deal. And for anyone who has kids, I have a 12-year-old daughter whose friends all have smartphones now, and she's got an Apple Watch. And you can just see that they're living in a very different world than I lived in, certainly when I was a kid growing up in the 80s and the 1990s. So I think that those statistics offer an important call to action, I would say. And one of the ideas that I like to play with here is that it's easy to say like, "Oh, well, we're all craving our screens, we're all addicted to our screens. We should probably do a few little things at the margins to see if we can try to improve our relationship to our screens and, hopefully that will be helpful." And I actually think it's way bigger than that. So Cal Newport wrote a book called Digital Minimalism, and he used a great analogy, I thought, where he likened this to a David and Goliath like struggle, where we are David, Goliath is all of these huge technology companies that are using the most sophisticated AI algorithms in all of human history, all toward the goal of like keeping us on site longer and essentially manipulating our psychology such that we have this insatiable craving for our screens. So I think that's just a helpful analogy because to me, what that says is, okay, we need to take this pretty seriously. We need to think both about what are the strategies we're going to use to be more skillful with our technology. That's the closing piece. But then to the other piece of the book and a lot of what I've been thinking about lately, I think it's bigger than just like how do we stop using our technology? It's also about how do we cultivate practices in the midst of our everyday life that allow us to be a little bit more open, a little bit more expansive because I think one misunderstanding about this screen addiction stuff is that it's not just this craving that's happening. There's also an underlying sense of unease for most of us that's fueling the craving. So if you go one level beneath the craving, what's really going on? Well, often there are these deeper emotional, psychological traumas and wounds that all of us are carrying around that make it so difficult to just be in the present moment in the first place. And I think we have to almost like go down to that deeper level to start to really unwind the thing that's keeping us, addicted to our screens.
That's a hard sell because you've got this candy store of delicious and
Yeah.
very effective ways of keeping us from feeling this horrible stuff that's under the surface for a lot of us. And I mean, I don't, a lot of us, even people of incredible privilege, are carrying around traumas. And it's not a competition for, I'm not suggesting that, but like, I think to be alive, to be human, you're carrying around stuff that in this day and age is probably unprocessed. But it is a hard sell. You can either have this little very handy dandy device that's never far away from you that will make it all go away over and over and over again. Or you can embark on a very unknown, terrifying journey that nobody told you about, that there's no guides for, or if there are, you have to really go and find them. It's a hard sell,
It is a
right?
hard sell. And I think you're right that in every moment, it's almost like we're at this fork in the road of life. And one path is lined with all of these amazing quick hits of pleasure. If you think about that as maybe the Instagram path or the TikTok path,
Yeah,
right? It's just seductive and it's easy and it's so pleasurable and it's so fun in a way.
yeah.
And then there's this other path, we'll call that just staying in the present moment in idle time, which is really kind of uncomfortable for most of us. And that path involves some discomfort and some unease and some boredom and some experiences that we might not want to fully face and some emotions that we don't want to feel. And so I think it is a really hard sell. And I also think in all of this, we should remember to stay compassionate toward
Mm-hmm,
ourselves and to
mm-hmm,
have that spirit of unconditional friendliness. That's what Pema Chodron calls it toward ourselves.
mm-hmm.
Because I actually think there are times where it's totally fine to binge on Netflix and it's totally fine
Yeah.
to binge on Instagram. And actually, I've set up this thing in my day that has worked really well for me that might work for others. I call it dopamine dessert. And the basic idea is instead of trying to resist all of this and be like, I'm never going to check my phone, and I'm never going to watch TV or whatever, I actually try to time box it. So in the middle of most days, usually when I'm eating lunch, I have my dopamine dessert. And what that means is I give myself a half hour or so to just totally binge on anything I want, go to any site that I want, just see the most base crappy stuff out there on the internet and it's okay. And what's cool about that is then in the morning when I have an urge to pick up my phone and look at the news or whatever, I can think to myself, "Oh, wait, I have dopamine dessert coming up. I don't need to check
Right.
this now."
Right.
So, all that's to say, like, I think we wanna be compassionate with ourselves. I think we wanna give ourselves the ability to indulge in this sometimes. There's nothing wrong with that, but we also wanna make sure it doesn't take us over.
I want to talk a little bit about the default mode. You write about something called the default mode in the book, and there's a little bit I'll read. I'll read a little bit again to set it up. Harvard psychologists Daniel Gilbert and Matthew Killingsworth found that the average person spends somewhere around 47% of their waking hours lost in this state of mind wandering. They also found a strong correlation between mind wandering and unhappiness, as they explain a human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. The ability to think about what is not happening is a cognitive achievement that comes at an emotional cost. This really surprised me because when I think about my mind wandering or daydreaming or, I it actually conjures, sort of good happy feelings. So I was surprised to learn that there what is the emotional cost of this wandering mind default mode that we go into?
I actually think you're pointing to a really important nuance of this whole discussion of mind wandering, because mind wandering is often correlated with stress. But it's interesting that there are also studies that show there's a correlation between mind wandering and creativity,
Mhm.
which I know is your wheelhouse. And that
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense, right? Like you think about the really creative insights and ideas you've had, at least for me, they're often ideas that come from being in a place of mind wandering for an extended period of time. And then all of a sudden, something just clicks. And I'm like,
Yes.
oh, that's it. That's the idea.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of nuance there. And what I would say is it's almost like there's two different forms of mind wandering.
Yeah.
There's a kind of mind wandering that's happening at a really high, fast pace with an amped up nervous system, which I think is the kind of mind wandering they're mostly talking about, where
Okay.
it's that experience of mental swirl that we all have, where you're just completely disconnected from the present moment. And there's just all this thinking about the past and the future and what do you got to do in 2 days or 10 years or whatever. And that I think is destructive in many cases because, if you think about the definition of anxiety, looping through thoughts about future, anticipating things, worst case scenarios, and that's almost exactly it, right? It's like negative mind wandering is anxiety, is stress. So there's that dimension of it, but the other dimension of it that I think is really interesting is when we are able to slow down a little bit and when we're able to have a little bit more contact with the present moment, that same experience of mind wandering can have can lead us into these amazing realms of creativity and insight. So it is kind of a weird thing. I think there are these two different experiences of mind wandering, and we're sort of having both all day, every day.
I'm so glad that we had this little moment here because that's so helpful. Because the other day, yesterday, I was thinking about talking to you today, and I was in the woods, and my mind was wandering, and I was like, "Oh no, my mind is wandering," and I found myself getting a little bit stressed about it. But what had just happened was that I had just had a really great creative idea, and so then I started thinking, well, that can't be bad, but I had never thought about the difference, that nuance before. And I think as we go through this process of opening more to these idle moments and opening ourselves up to the richness that can happen in an open mind, it, this could be a really helpful sort of pointer or instruction, like to notice the feeling of the quality of the kind of mind wandering that you're doing. Is it that amped up nervous system? Am I worried about, oh God, it's taxes? And, all the crazy worries that we have that are just on that feedback loop. Or is it that other kind? And to just be able to even tell the difference between the two could help you on your way. I'm so
I
glad
think
you
you're
said that.
absolutely right. And I was having that same experience before we talked today. I intentionally went for a walk, with no earbuds. I was just walking. And I had the same experience where I was thinking about creativity and what are some of the experiences of creativity I've had. And it was a very wandering mind. And then, my mind would think about, oh, I got to pack for this trip that's happening tomorrow and this and that. But there was something beautiful about it in the sense that I was able to cover some ground prior to our conversation that was helpful to prepare me. So there was a moment, I think, of productive mind wandering. My nervous system was not in that super amp state. I was in nature. It was a sunny day. It was beautiful. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a cool and interesting distinction. And to your point, having the awareness to be able to distinguish between the two, I think, is really valuable because if you're in that more amped up form of mental swirl style mind wandering, that's often not productive at all and creates a lot of stress and anxiety. One tool you can think about is just what can I do right now to relax my underlying biology and my nervous system such that I can move to that deeper experience of almost contemplation, might be a better word for mind wandering at that point,
Yeah. Or openness.
or openness. Exactly.
I want to talk about Happy Land. And I'm going to read the little paragraph again that you have in the book from Happy Land because that just really resonated for me. I know that this place doesn't exist, can't exist, never will exist. I'm sure you know this too. But somehow that doesn't matter. Somehow we still live as though we're one diet hack, meditation, promotion, drug journey, sexual escapade, remodel, international vacation, or lavish meal away from Happy Land. It's always right there in front of us, like that rabbit racing along the rail at the dog track, always just one step out of reach. So when we fail to grasp it, which happens every single time, it's because we did something wrong. We screwed up. We trusted the wrong influencer, ate the wrong thing, read the wrong book, took the wrong job, booked the wrong flight, swiped the wrong dating profile, or chose the wrong self improvement program. First of all, we're so hard on ourselves, right? But how do we
Yeah.
break free of the illusion of happy land? Like there is no happy land. All of the things that we're doing and all the Instagram, all the striving, all the there is it doesn't exist and we know that conceptually.
Yeah.
But how do we finally break free of the illusion of happy land so that we know it in our bones so that we can be free of it?
Mhm. Yeah. This idea of happy land, I think, is a trap all of us experience. And to go back to that analogy I used before of the two roads, the road lined with pleasure, that's maybe the road of happy land. And then the other road, which is the road where we might experience some discomfort or emotional unease or something that doesn't feel good. Basically, we live in a culture where the gravitational center is all about that road of pleasure. And I don't know about you, but every time I go on Instagram or even look at my podcast app, your podcast being an exception, but many of the others are all about this idea that, like, if you just do all of these things and you fast intermittently and you meditate every day and you exercise every day and you work out and you lift weights, you're going to live to 180 years old and you're going to feel amazing all day, every day. And I think that this is like an illusion that's been really deeply ingrained into our modern consciousness. And this, I think, is one of the biggest barriers to cultivating a more open mind because this illusion keeps us coming back to that state of closure. There's a way in which there's actually a tightness to it. There's a compression to it. There's this idea that you need to control everything and you need to hold it all together. And that's how you're going to get to this place called Happy Land. And this was an insight that kept coming up again and again for me throughout the journey of this whole process in this book was seeing just how deeply trapped I was in this illusion and how at every turn the biggest insights and the biggest creative moments came during those moments where I realized, oh my gosh, there's no happy land here. There's like what's actually more skillful now is to just be open to whatever happens to be arising. I'll give you one concrete example because all of this is kind of abstract. I've had this ringing in my ear for 15 years, tinnitus, and I spent well over a decade just trying to control this thing and get rid of this thing and essentially shift from a state where Nate has tinnitus to a state where Nate is happy all the time and his ears sound amazing. And so I tried everything you can imagine. I scoured the internet for every supplement and practice and this and that, and nothing ever worked. And the way I actually was finally able to come to peace with this ringing in my ear was paradoxically to just stop the efforting and just realize I have ringing in my ear. I'm going to just like open to this experience of the ringing in my ear. I'm going to see if I can welcome this experience. I might not always like it. I might not always feel good, but paradoxically, that was the way I was able to achieve this kind of peace, I would say, with this thing that had been tormenting me. So to me, that's another it's a more concrete example of what it might look like to let go of the illusion of happy land and open to whatever happens to be arising in the moment, even if it's not what we want.
There's a passage in the book where you talk about the flight that you're on when you have that moment
Yeah.
where you surrender to it. To me, it struck me that you were surrendered rather than you chose. Like they're different.
Yeah.
It's a nuance, but it is to surrender is something that you choose to do, and to
Yep.
be surrendered is something that happens to you as a result of other forces that are not just up to you. And I feel so confused about how to get to surrender with these things, because it's almost like I used to have a meditation teacher who would say, well, you'll just keep going until you run out of gas in the can. There's actually, and you, it's not up to you how much gas there is in your can. We don't know how much gas. So you'll just keep going. And then one day you'll stop. And then you'll realize, that was kind of his teaching. But are there things we can do to hasten that letting go, that surrender? You've had several, and I'm sure all of us have had several life experiences that we can point to where we're like, oh, that was the moment where it was almost like I was so at the bottom. I was so at the core of my suffering. I was empty. I didn't know what to do. I was so lost, and I asked for help. And then in that little moment, it opens up, and it's not always that dramatic, though. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Are there ways that we can cultivate the conditions to be surrendered from the things that are costing us all of this?
As you're asking that question, I was actually just coming up with this distinction that I had never thought about before, which is a distinction between extraordinary moments of letting go and surrender and everyday moments of letting go and surrender. And to your point, those extraordinary moments of letting go and surrender are so beyond our control. To even call them a practice, I think is like a lie.
Yeah.
I mean, I write about a couple moments in the book where, yes, I had an experience of letting go and surrendering, but did I try to do it? Did I make it happen? Was I the conductor of that experience? Not at all. It was more like I found myself in a situation where my ordinary model of life and how the world worked was just crushed by life. And I had no choice but to just open up to something else. I mean, it just happened. And so I think those are actually extraordinary moments. And one thing I would say about those moments is that for me anyway, and I think for most of us, when they happen, they're usually perceived as some of the worst moments of our life. And so it's really interesting just to have the awareness that those quote unquote worst moments of our life can paradoxically be the best moments of our life.
Hmm.
So there's that. But then to your point, I think there is this other class of letting go and surrender that's more everyday and ordinary that we do have a little bit more control over. And there are certain practices I think we can use to do that. So one of the practices I do a lot and I write a lot about is meditation and mindfulness. I think that the essence of a mindfulness practice, when you're just sitting there for 30 minutes or so, or 10 minutes or 20 minutes, and allowing whatever happens in your body or your mind to be as it is, that is kind of like a training, a strengthening and conditioning program for letting go, because
Right.
the whole time that things are happening outside of your control, my neck is hurting, I'm tired, I shouldn't be tired, all this stuff is happening. And you're just coming back to that place of like, okay, that I can welcome this. I can allow this to be exactly as it is. So there's that. But then I also think practices like yoga and certain forms of breath work where we're intentionally relaxing the nervous system can also be really conducive to letting go because, at least in my experience, the more amped my nervous system is, the tighter my mind and body are, the more difficult it is to surrender to some of these uncomfortable emotions or experiences. So there's a way in which that is a practice we control and it's a practice we decide to do, but it's also like planting the seeds
Right.
such that letting go can arise organically on its own more often.
The image I had when you were saying that was that it's almost like when you do these practices like meditation or breath work, you're almost training your system, all the cells in your body, to know what it's like for game day when the big thing happens. It can go, oh yeah, we've done this. It was smaller when we did it when we were just sitting on our meditation cushion, but I think we know the formula for this. We open to it.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to talk about psychedelic assisted therapy as a way of opening and healing. In the lead up to this part of the book, you name a bunch of reasons why it's something that you would never do. And I was totally with you. I'm a
Yeah.
super conservative nerd. I actually came from a really chaotic family where there was a lot of drug use and addiction. And so I grew up as somebody who was like, I'm not going to do those things. So I was like, Nate and I are on the same
Mm.
page. And you,
And then Nate went
and
off
you,
the deep end.
and then Nate went off the deep end and did it. Tell me about your experience with ketamine assisted therapy.
Well, you're right. I entered this whole project. First of all, I wasn't even planning to write about psychedelics, let alone take psychedelics. But I started to realize that there was all this amazing research out there, the second wave of psychedelic science that's happening right now. There's a case to be made that some of the advances happening in psychedelic treatments, psychedelic assisted therapy, are the equivalent of the kind of revolution they had in psychiatry 50 years ago with SSRIs. That really there hasn't been a big idea or a big breakthrough like this in a long time.
Mm.
And some of the data coming out of these studies is really impressive. So I started to think if I'm going to write about what it means to cultivate a more open mind and unlock some of these deep scars and patterns we have, I should at least think about this, maybe experience this. So the other thing that opened up the door for me around this is that there's this really important distinction I came to see between psychedelics, the compounds themselves, things like LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, and psychedelic assisted therapy, the pairing of these compounds with a skilled guide, an intentional structure of support, integration, and all that. Once I started to see that distinction and read the research that really when you're engaged in psychedelic assisted therapy, you can mitigate a lot of the risks that arise in recreational use. And those risks are huge. I mean, I write in the book about like people I knew who had catastrophically bad trips and, so bad, like a relative of mine got to a point where he had major depression for 30 years, couldn't hold down a job after taking LSD once at a rock concert.
Hmm.
So for some people, these compounds can be really, really bad. So there's a very high risk, but I think for some people, there's a potential reward there that's pretty high as well. And what I learned over the course of experiencing this firsthand is that there's a way in which, at least for me, the experience of psychedelic assisted therapy allowed me to open to what I would describe as the unopenable.
Mm.
Certain parts of my mind that if I were to try to go there in ordinary consciousness, like there's just too much resistance to even touch it. So one example is I've had a fear of flying, like flight anxiety for about 20 years. And during one of these psychedelic assisted therapy sessions, I found myself on this plane and I'm flying around and I feel something that's very strange to me. I feel totally relaxed and at ease while flying on a plane. And then I'm watching myself on this plane as the plane is careening to the ground. And I watch myself and every other passenger get incinerated. And, tell my therapist, oh my God, like I'm watching this plane crash. It's a work of art. It's all so beautiful. It's God. I realize God is a plane crash. And I know that sounds absolutely insane. But what's not insane about that experience is that then when I would go to fly on a plane, it was like my mind had this alternative pathway that I didn't have access to before, where I'd feel some anxiety and all of a sudden these images of I called it the ketamine express would arise in my mind. And so I think this is not for everyone. And I try to make a really big deal that there's so many ways we can open more space in the mind that don't involve this. Like, this is not a mandatory step on the journey. But for some people, it might be a really powerful way of opening up to experiences that they haven't been able to process in any other way.
Yeah, I thought about that a lot, as I went through that part of the book because as I shared earlier, I am somebody who's gone through I went through a tremendous amount of childhood trauma and am a very functional adult. I have really amazing
Mm,
protective parts that came in and were like, we're gonna it's fascinating to watch, but there is a lot of undigested stuff. And I have
yeah,
found a lot of frustration with the incremental nature of traditional psych. And I mean,
yeah,
I have the best therapist in the world. She's amazing, and we've done some great work together. But it did make me wonder when I read your book if this might be something that because there are places that are just so protected, and these parts that I've generated are so good at protecting them.
yeah,
It really is amazing, but I don't I think I'm ready for they're not ready to let go, but I'm ready for
right.
them to let go. And so I have wondered. So I was very grateful that you went first.
The guinea pig.
Thank you for being the guinea pig. And I was surprised. I didn't realize that some of those things were that ketamine, for example, was FDA. I didn't know that.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think that the one last thing I would say about psychedelics is the best tip I could offer anybody is just to be really careful and really tap into your own intuition. I investigated assisted therapy for a couple of years. I have primarily had experiences with two compounds, ketamine and MDMA, but my intuition has been very clear for me that there are other compounds out there that sound fascinating and I'm super curious about them, but I'm just not going to touch those things
Hmm.
because I know my mind is somewhat delicate. It's prone to fear and anxiety. And I just have this sense that there are certain compounds out there that don't have the same kind of safety blanket that a compound like ketamine and MDMA have
Hmm.
that would just rock my world and that
Hmm.
I am not ready for, maybe will never be ready for. So all that's to say, like, I think this is a place where there's a meta practice of opening here around something like psychedelic assisted therapy, which is really opening to that deeper voice, that deeper intuition, and seeing if there's a yes there, seeing if there's a no there, and having that itself be a practice.
What would you say? I mean, your ketamine journey and also just all the other things that you did as a result of this book. What would you say the impact has been on your intuition and your creativity and that inner voice? Like if you were to look at Nate 3 years ago and Nate today, what do you think is the biggest change that you've personally undergone?
Well, there's something interesting about writing a book that's so deeply personal and so vulnerable. That was a creative challenge that I wasn't quite sure I was up for. But then I wrote a book and it went off to press and it was kind of too late to pull back, which is really fun. I mean, that in itself has a psychedelic feel to it. This feeling of like, okay, here we go. I don't know if I can handle this, but here we go. So that was a really big unlock for me just to see that I could put some pretty vulnerable experiences and parts of myself down on a piece of paper and turn it into a book and that the world could read it. And some people could say this was amazing. And some people could say, I hate this. You're a narcissist, you're neurotic or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you go on the Goodreads or Amazon reviews, you'll find something like that for every book, really. But that I think was a helpful creative moment for me because I started to realize, okay, well, if I can take that risk, what are some of the other risks that I can take creatively? Because I survived. I'm still alive. Nothing horrible has happened to me. And I think that feels like a big part of, at least for me, my whole creative process has a lot of it has had to do with fear. and this feeling of like, I don't know that I could do that. That feels too big. That feels too scary. And then training myself and my nervous system to get to a point where I can do that. And then there's like the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And for me, I don't know, creativity and being with fear feel very, very much like intertwined as a process. I don't know if you
Mhm.
I'm curious, do you have that experience as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of you have to make really good friends with uncertainty
Yeah,
because you're stepping fully into the unknown
totally.
and you're not really there anymore if you're doing it right. I mean, not that there's
Yeah,
a right and wrong. I don't want to, there's a paradox with every word that you're going to use, but yeah, that also applies to then what happens when you put it out into the world,
yeah.
you know? And you just, there's a lot of, yeah, I think it's the same. I think it's the same thing. You talk in the book about, at one point, I think you say something like, just because you can open to everything doesn't mean that you should. And I thought that was worth pointing out because I had a little bit of that feeling when you were going into the psychedelic. I was like, well, just because he can doesn't mean he should. And then you did it and I read it and I understood and then it was the right decision. I'm really glad that you did that. And I was happy that that it worked out the way it did.
Yeah.
But there are times when I actually think the mechanism of closing is very wise. Like I talked about my own protective parts. Like they did that for me to save me from something truly terrible. And thank God they did. I wouldn't probably be here in the form that I am today. So closing actually is a really important part of being alive. And I think through this conversation, what we're realizing is that we're using that tool a little bit too much. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this idea of discernment. How do we begin to understand and learn and know what things are appropriate to open to and what things are appropriate to close to, given that we live in this fear based world? Like the context of most of our existence is fear. Like that's what drives so many of the systems around us, and so much of our own systems are driven by fear. So, given that that's our kind of backdrop, what part of ourselves do we need to tap into to accurately know what to close to and what to open to?
I think this is a really important point, and I started off by thinking that opening was an unqualified good, that we should open more and open more and open more, and there are a lot of teachings out there in the spiritual world of this kind that say, everything is workable, open to everything, even the deepest fears and this and that, and I don't necessarily think those are bad, but I had this one experience that just really floored me and taught me the lesson of what I would call the need to skillfully close sometimes, which is that I was getting this pretty major gum surgery and I decided it would be really interesting to turn this into like a hardcore opening experiment. So I talked the surgeon into letting me do it without sedation and just stay awake during this procedure, which was supposed to be 90 minutes, but then it ended up being 3 hours. And it was like such a crazy, horrible, painful experience. And my daughter was in the waiting room hearing me scream. And it created a lot of unnecessary suffering for me, for my daughter, for my wife, for the surgeon, for the nurses. And so I had this moment after the fact as I was reflecting on all this, realizing at this deep, visceral level that yes, opening is good. We want to strive toward cultivating a more expansive mind. And I actually do believe that we can open to almost every part of ourselves, even those really deeply scarred, traumatized parts of ourselves. We need radical support to do it. Certain medicines can help us get there, but that doesn't mean we need to open all the way all the time.
Mm.
And so there's this idea of skillful closing that I've been playing with a lot, which is basically just the idea that sometimes it's more loving to yourself and the world to close skillfully than open. I interviewed Anna Forrest, who is a really famous yoga teacher, and she told me about being in a state of recovery from addiction. And that if she didn't close down to her previous friends and relationships, she would have fallen back into addiction. That was not a good choice for her or for her family. When it comes to this question of like, how do we discern? It's not necessarily easy, but the guideline that I would put out there is it's often a good thing to see if you can open to discomfort, unless it's kinder or more loving to yourself or others to close. That's kind of the guideline that I use. And I know it's not an exact formula, but that's been really helpful for me as I think about this for myself. That there are certain moments I encounter in life where I say to myself, that's that's not the best moment to open. I would be better off, the world would be better off if I skillfully closed in this moment.
Sometimes saying no to something is saying yes to something else.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
So it's everything. I mean, everything is a paradox. Everything is and it becomes about taking a step back and looking at, oh, yes, I'm closing to this, but what am I opening to
Yeah,
by closing to this? And
totally.
learning to be maybe more at the wheel. I guess like a higher part of ourselves is at the wheel deciding which lever to pull rather than just, having it go on by. Because right now I think we're on autopilot. I think that's the problem is that we're on autopilot and we're mostly closing. And that,
Yes.
that's a problem in its own way. But if we're all open, it can't be
Yeah.
that either, because then it's just a disaster in another way. So it's a matter of like, how do we learn to, yeah, drive this thing properly?
Yeah. The philosopher in me, what came up for me is Aristotle. He defines virtue as the mean between too much and too little of something, which I think is just such a brilliant way to define it. So if you
Yeah.
think about that with respect to opening and closing, what he's essentially saying is you don't want to do too little of it. You don't want to close down all the time, but you also don't want to do too much of it. You don't want to go around saying yes to everything, yes to every incoming request, yes to the person who wants to scam you on the phone. Like that's not a good way to live either. But the other idea he had that I think is useful here is that if you are stuck on one side of that polarity, and I think most of us are stuck on the closed side, it can be very powerful to what he calls overshoot the mean. So to
Yeah.
go a little further than that middle point toward the side of openness, because if you do that, you're probably going to end up kind of in that middle range. So I think it's actually okay to experience or experiment or explore radical forms of opening. You just don't want to go too far.
I love that. I love that. At the end of every episode, I ask what I call the billboard question. And normally the way I ask it is, if you had a billboard that, let's assume that there's all these people out there who long to open and wish they could open, but are struggling with it, don't know how to open, don't know when they're closing, don't know, worried about getting like all the things we've talked about. And you could write one thing on this billboard that would grab their attention and sort of calm their system down so that they could hear what they needed to hear. What would you put on the billboard?
The first thing that comes to mind is it's okay to stop trying so hard.
Oh, I love that.
Because
I love
because this is one
that.
of the paradoxes of what we're talking
Yeah.
about. Same with creativity, right? Like, if we're treating opening like the way we treat other things in life, building a business, training for a marathon, all the other things we do in life, as this thing we're just gonna grind it out, we're gonna effort our way there, I don't think we're actually gonna experience much opening. So that's the paradox, and I guess the billboard, I think, could be useful in the sense that it's
Mm,
like, what if you just stop trying so hard and then see what happens? And that's a lesson
love
I
that.
have to tell myself again and again and again with everything, with my business, with writing, with doing a podcast. It's just like, if you stop trying so hard, like all of a sudden, everything can really start to open up in a kind of magical way. But boy, that's a countercultural concept.
It is. Definitely is. Thank you so much for joining me today. I loved this conversation so much. How do we support you and your work and what you're doing? How do we learn more about you? Where do we buy your book? What's the best way to support you?
The book is available everywhere books are sold. Open, Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World. And best way to find me is my website's Nate Klemp with a K.com. I'm also on Instagram at Nate_Klemp. And I try to be, it's a strange practice, but I try to be like on Instagram, giving people tips on how to not be on Instagram while also trying not to be on Instagram myself. So it's a weird thing I'm trying to do there. I haven't totally figured it out, but I love the idea of having a community of people who are interested in this sort of practice. And that's a goal of mine, a dream of mine, is to have a place where we can all just kind of share how we're experiencing this.
I love that. And you have a great newsletter people can sign up for on your
Yes,
website.
absolutely. Thank you for
And
bringing
you
that
have
up.
some meditations and you have actually at the end of the book there's a really great sort of like toolkit for how to get started and some practices to
Exactly.
do some of these things. So I really would encourage everybody to check that out too.
Yeah.